Hey everyone, welcome back to our study of Acts as now Paul is finally launched out to sea on his journey to Rome. And as we are going to see here today, the journey is not just a travel log, but rather it's opportunities for Paul's power of his witness and faith and the power given to him by the Holy Spirit to continue proclaiming the gospel even as he makes his transit between Jerusalem and Rome for his ultimate destiny. And it wouldn't be Paul if there weren't challenges and hardships along the way that face him, and yet we see the power of the gospel proclaimed in the midst of these challenges, these unique and new challenges from our perspective as readers. And yet, I want you to hear those things and not just see this as some sort of story about a sailing ship at sea, but rather the continued work of God in new and powerful ways. So let's open with our prayer and then we'll get started. Let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Real quick before we get started, just a reminder again about our wrap-up Zoom meeting, Sunday, October the 18th at 5 o'clock. I would love to have you on there, even if none of you join me, which I hope some of you will. I really don't want to just be on there by myself. But regardless, I do have a few points that will wrap up our study of Acts, but I do want to have some conversation, mainly interested in what you got out of Acts and any questions you might have from our reading that you would like to have answered. And I will have that recorded as well to where it can be posted on YouTube and watched at a later date. Just wanted to remind you, as I will be for the next few days as we get closer and closer to that date. All right, so now let's jump in. Our reading for today's chapter 27, verses 9 through 26. Since much time had been lost and sailing was now dangerous, because even the fast had already gone by, Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I can see that the voyage will be with danger and much heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. Since the harbor was not suitable for spending the winter, the majority was in favor of putting to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix where they could spend the winter. It was a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest. When a moderate south wind began to blow, they thought they could achieve their purpose. So they weighed anchor and began to sail past Crete close to the shore. But soon a violent wind called the northeaster rushed down from Crete. Since the ship was caught and could not be turned head on into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven. By running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After hoisting it up, they took measures to undergird the ship. Fearing that they would run on the Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and so were driven. We were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard, and on the third day with their own hands they threw the ship's tackle overboard. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest raged, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. They had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete, and thereby avoided this damage and loss. I urge you now to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For last night there stood by me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor. And indeed, God has granted safety to all those who were sailing with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we will have to run aground on some island. All right, so this time, ask our map to come up here and ask Elizabeth, put me down as a little talking head in the corner here, but really today's reading is one, yeah, the map's kind of important for today's reading. So just a little recap from yesterday, from the second half of yesterday, because really we didn't spend a whole lot of time on the voyage yesterday because the first part of yesterday's passage was so full of stuff. But you can see from the map here, Paul sets out from Caesarea, makes a stop at Sidon where he visits with some of the believers. Then they sail up around the north side or the leeward side of Cyprus, the short side in this case, and sail along the coast of Asia Minor and make a couple of stops there, then stop at Cnidus, the port that's right there on the southwestern edge of what is modern day Turkey or Asia back in those days. And then they set sail to go south towards the island of Crete, again hitting the leeward side, although not necessarily the short side, trying to get the wind, but it's taking them a long time. You got a little sense of this yesterday, but now you're getting a big sense of it today as they struggle finally to get to this part on the south side of Crete called the Fair Havens near the city of Lasea, and that's where we pick up today. And it starts with an ominous foreboding, since much time had been lost and sailing was now dangerous. Well, the two things that were most important to a sailor, as they are still today, are the time, because the quicker the voyage, the more money you can make, even though this clearly was not a commercial vessel, and yet there was probably some economic interests being served on this vessel. You don't think they're just hauling a bunch of prisoners without hauling something of value on that ship, just an assumption, and an assumption based on evidence from that day and age, but also the safety of the ship, looking for the right winds, trying to avoid storms, the same concerns that sailors still have today, despite the infinite advances in seafaring that we now have today. This also would have been a tool to alert readers of Luke's day that there is danger afoot on the high seas. Plenty of good classical works, the Odyssey comes to mind, for instance, of good seafaring voyages, that those type of works would have been known to Luke's audience. So whether you're Jew or Gentile, those type of things would have been in the mind to say there is danger ahead for those on this voyage, just as we would hear that reading novels like Moby Dick or knowing real life sea stories like the Titanic, where you might want to listen to some of these warnings that are going out. So there is this sense that something bad is about to happen, and we're going to see particularly what that is in tomorrow's reading. But when that ominous tone has been set, Paul chirps up, advising them, saying, "Sirs, I can see that the voyage will be with danger and much heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Well, what makes Paul such an expert? In fact, one commentator, among the several that I'm looking at as I prepare these lessons, said that Paul's a little full of himself. And it's clear from some other things that this one commentator doesn't really like Paul all that much. But the rest of the commentators, as well as my own personal opinion, Paul, number one, he's been on a few voyages. He's not an expert sailor, but he's been on enough, as we've seen in Acts, to be able to offer an opinion. The second thing is, keep in mind that Paul offers a word of prophecy. He is a prophet. We have seen that clearly through Acts. He speaks about what God is about to do. So he is speaking here not so much in his, I'm a sailor, I know what I'm doing, but rather from this prophetic sense. Tied into this reality that you're going to see a little bit in the background of this story, there are some very implicit references to the story of Jonah. You remember Jonah, the guy who was swallowed by a big fish and spent 3 days in the belly of a fish. Well, if you remember anything else about that story, Jonah was at sea because he was called by God to go as a prophet to the city of Nineveh, that wicked city, which was the head city of the Assyrian Empire, that same Assyrian Empire which conquered the kingdom of Israel and took it into exile. Yes, that wicked city. And Jonah's like, I'm doing that. So he flees and goes the other way on a ship. And uh, his prophetic message to start with was one of fleeing from the danger that was present instead of facing it with confidence in God head on. So there's a little bit of innuendo going on there about Jonah, and we'll see a little bit more of that as well in today's reading. The other part of this opening passage is it talks about time again because even the fast had already gone by. The fast is the Day of Atonement, or what we call today Yom Kippur. Our Jewish sisters and brothers still celebrate Yom Kippur. It was historically the one day that back when temple worship was still taking place, or tabernacle worship before that, the high priest, who was Aaron, or then later one of his sons, would that on that one day and that one day alone would offer sacrifices and then take part of the blood of the sacrifice and sprinkle it on the Ark of the Covenant and the items that were in the most holy place in the sanctuary. But otherwise, human beings were not allowed into that except for that one ritual on that one day. Well, Paul, being a pious Jew, was hoping to find a place where he could celebrate Yom Kippur. The other part of that, though, that's important, and keep this in mind as we talk about time, which becomes part of this story as well, is that Paul is very much on a Jewish calendar. Seems normal. The Romans are on, they were using at that point the Julian calendar. They're on their own Gentile calendar. But from the perspective of the Romans, they're on a time schedule. They're trying to get somewhere. They want to get this ship full of prisoners somewhere, drop off their cargo, and then move on to the next stop. Paul is on God's time. Yeah, it's obviously Jew and Gentiles, not one's exclusive of God. Gentiles don't have God, Jews do. But in this sense, the time frame is very much prevalent implicitly here. Paul's on God's time. He's not in a hurry. Where would he have to go as a prisoner except to Rome, which eventually he'll get there. But he is basically just going along with wherever the Spirit guides him in this case, because truly he's not in control of any of this, except, notably so, he has faith that whatever happens, it is part of his destiny that God is leading him to Rome. So keep that in mind. This whole reference to the Jewish calendar is also a reference that God's time is what is being accomplished here on this ship. So Paul speaks up, but the centurion, Julius, pays more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship. Like the Titanic. When the Titanic was, in danger of an iceberg, or there were warnings of it, some of the notable people sailing on the ship just wanted the captain to keep going. Of course, some of that's in the James Cameron movie, but some of that's also from what we do know in real life that Captain Smith was under pressure to get the ship where it needed to be quickly and in time, and we know how that turned out. And a similar fate is awaiting this ship as well. But we're not quite there yet. They decide the harbor where they're at, the Fair Havens near the city of Lacey, is not suitable for the winter. So then they're trying to set off to sea, that they reach Phoenix, which is a port right on the western tip of the island of Crete, which for varying reasons would have been a better winter port. And that's a serious and very important observation. It's not that they're just trying to beat the clock and try to get somewhere fast. They're trying to find a suitable place to spend the winter, because at that point, with the difficulty they have, they realize that they're not going to get there as quickly as they would like, but they like to push on as far as they can. And that's what Paul's arguing with them about. Like, you might want to think about that. So initially, verse 13, a moderate south wind begins to blow as they set off from the south side of Crete. And so they stay close to the shore thinking, we got this. This is great. This is going to be wonderful. But then, if you've lived in New England, you know what these are. A nor'easter comes rushing down off the island of Crete, which basically is pushing the ship off to sea. So if the wind's blowing out of the north and northeast, it's obviously pushing the ship back out into the open seawater. So they virtually have no shot at getting to Phoenix now, because they're going to have to go a little northwest in order to get there. So basically, the ship is being driven where it goes, which is the worst nightmare of any captain of any sailboat, to not have any control over where your ship goes. But past the reality of sea travel, that the winds being unpredictable, sometimes you just can't help it. So they try to have some control by going under the lee of a little small island that you see just off the southwestern coast of Crete, called Cauda, which today is an island called Gavdos, which is the southernmost island of the Greek chain of islands that is there today in the modern country of Greece. They gain a tad of control by doing that, but then they try to raise up the anchor, and then they're fearing that they would run on the Syrtis. What they're really fearing is they're going to run on a sandbar somewhere, which is ironically what happens to them in the next chapter. They run on a sandbar, so they lower the sea anchor. They continue to be driven, and then the storm continues to pound them. It's not so much that there's rain and all of this, it's just the wind is so powerful that they begin throwing cargo overboard, and on the third day, with their own hands, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. And again, here's Jonah. If you remember from that story, or if you don't, a part of that story, when Jonah is out to sea, a huge storm comes up on the boat that he's rented passage on to take him to wherever he's going away from Nineveh. And the sailors start throwing things off the ship, trying to lighten the load so they'll have a little more control of the ship and it won't be buffeted nearly as much. And ultimately, what they find out is Jonah's responsible for this. So they throw him off the ship. And so that same word, the tackle, is what was being thrown off the ship here in this case. And verse 20, then it's okay, a doomed sea voyage if there ever was one, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. Now that's indicative of a storm when that's the case. And no small tempest raged. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. The ship's going to sink. What are you going to do? The ship's going down. And that's the end of the story. Come back off the map. Come back to me now. Because now that we're out at the open sea, we don't need the map for this. But then this is where the God part of the story kicks in. Since they had been without food for a long time, which could have been either they were fasting to try to ration supplies, or the ship was moving around so much that they were getting seasick if they tried to eat anything, probably a combination of both, Paul stood up among them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and thereby avoided this damage and loss. I told you so. No, that's actually not what Paul's doing here. It's not an I told you so. It's from the position of saying, well, this is in case you're wanting to blame the gods or my God for this or any other god, somebody, some person on the ship. Again, that's an insinuation from Jonah because Jonah was the one who was blamed for the storm that was buffeting the ship he was on. It's your fault. You made this decision. You need to own it. Don't be casting blame on anyone else. That's more of what this is along the lines of, which serves the point of focusing on what he's about to say next. I urge you now to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Yes, nice, Paul. That's great. Hopeless, empty words that you're speaking to us. But he's not done. Last night there stood by me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor. And indeed, God has granted safety to all those who are sailing with you. Vision. An angel of the Lord in this case. Again, keeping with the theme we've seen in Acts every time in a moment of great suffering, whether it was Peter or Stephen or Paul, there's a vision. And visions, they differ a little bit in what's being revealed to them, but the content is often the same. Keep up your courage. I am with you. Seems like an odd time from a secular perspective to say, I'm going to Rome. This God's keeping me going to Rome. We're trying to keep the ship afloat. You're talking about God sending you to Rome to stand in front of the emperor. Big whoop-de-doo. But there is this very, and it's not, I wouldn't even call this implicit, it's very much out there on the surface here in Luke. Here by this point in the book, if you're with Paul, remember how people were touching Paul's clothes and finding healing from those, that the power of the Spirit was going out from him. Well, now it's just by being with him that God's safety and welfare are being had upon the people on this boat. When it talks about all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned, this is another reference to salvation that references just not only the spiritual side, but again, salvation also as a physical element to it. The physical leads to the spiritual salvation, and the spiritual ultimately is the goal of salvation. But just like when Paul and others were healing people who were sick, raising the dead, those kind of things, that was a way of saying that salvation applied to physical needs, infirmities, failures, and anxieties as well. And in this case, the danger of being on a ship that seemed doomed to failure. And Paul is simply saying and repeating this vision, in which I'm sure probably he had a bit of anxiety. It wouldn't surprise me if he did. But again, his anxiety, if he had it, was tempered significantly by the fact that he knew what his mission was. Then he was reassured by this vision that he received that those who were with him on this voyage, God would save. God has granted safety. God has given salvation, is what it literally says. Sound a little different. God has given salvation to all those who were sailing with you. It's not just saying physical salvation. That's also the spiritual salvation, because as we see, Paul's going to continue to share his faith as this voyage goes on. So Paul continues with his encouragement, keep up your courage, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But it doesn't mean we're not going to run in trouble. We will eventually crash this ship on some island. Nowhere yet. We'll find that out tomorrow. But the impetus of salvation in the midst of a doomed sea voyage. Again, think of reading all the stories of where we see vessels crash and sailors lose their lives, these classic epics of Greek mythology where the same thing happens. God is changing the outcome of these all too familiar stories. The ship's not doomed. It will be saved because my servant Paul is on that ship, and in him and through him and with him, all who are with him will ultimately find destiny of this new life that comes to believe in me. So, it's not just a seafaring voyage, it's another opportunity for God's good news to be proclaimed among people who kind of need to hear some good news at this point. So let's stop there. So we will finish chapter 27 tomorrow, verses 27 through 44, and find out where Paul and them crash and some of the things that happened to them after they crash. I look forward to being with you again tomorrow. Take care and see you then.